Welcome to the Mano podcast. We are joined today by Simón Carlo Valentín, Esquire, CPA. Simón is a corporate and tax attorney and certified public accountant licensed in Puerto Rico and the U.S. District Court of Puerto Rico. He holds a JD and MBA with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, all from the University of Puerto Rico. His diverse experience includes serving as executive vice president of a major federal contractor, CFO and counsel for an international conglomerate, and an advisor to a private equity fund. He's worked at a Big Four accounting firm and has contributed to legal scholarship on financial regulation. Simón is a passionate advocate of statehood for Puerto Rico and has done multiple presentations and talks on how Puerto Rico can transition its tax model under statehood to optimize economic growth and opportunity. Welcome to the show, Simón Carlo.
Thank you so much, George. It's an honor to be here today. It's a great opportunity to be joining you here at Mano a Mano. And as you mentioned, I do love talking about Puerto Rico, taxes, and all that. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation today on that topic.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Simón, here at the Mano a Mano podcast, we often discuss the issues impacting efforts to resolve Puerto Rico's territory status and how they connect to these broader conversations about what's happening in America at the national level. There's a lot going on right now related to taxes and tariffs, including, of course, the recent global news about President Trump's tariffs policies, April being the month when most people file their federal and state tax returns, and also tax reform legislation being advanced. And in this case, it's both happening at the federal level in Congress and then also in Puerto Rico. So we wanted to bring you in as an expert to help us break down these issues and help our audience understand a little bit more what is happening and how this can impact U.S. Puerto Rico relations. One of the things that I think would be super helpful is if we kind of start out at the ground level, thinking about this from the perspective of the residents of Puerto Rico, right? So one of the key things that we hear about a lot of the time when it comes to residents on the island, and particularly when the issue of, efforts to try to resolve Puerto Rico's political status comes up, is a concern and even fear about, how federal taxes can be applied to the island. From your perspective, what is your response to concerns that, people raise about, federal taxes, how they apply to the island? Maybe just explain just how federal taxes apply to the island residents right now, and then we can kind of go into the concerns.
So definitely, this is one of the biggest misconceptions that everyone has on taxes in Puerto Rico. And when I say everyone, I mean it. It's from lawmakers, from Congress people to citizens. Everyone has a misconception on this, and they think that Puerto Ricans don't pay any federal taxes, and that's simply not true. So under the Federal Internal Revenue Code, Section 933 exempts Puerto Rico residents from paying federal taxes on Puerto Rico sourced income. So that means that any income that is determined to be sourced from Puerto Rico can be exempted from federal taxes if you live in Puerto Rico, if you're a bona fide Puerto Rico resident. Now, this doesn't mean that all types of income are exempt. And here we have to delve a little more into the technical aspect, but I'm going to be brief and try to keep it simple. Each type of income that an individual or a company has a different sourcing rule. So the simplest one we can think about are salaries and wages. Whatever the individual performs that work, it's where that income is going to be taxed. So obviously, you are a W-2 employee working out of Puerto Rico, that's going to be Puerto Rico sourced income. If you are a W-2 employee working out of Washington, D.C., then that's going to be federal income. And that's the case, for example, with the resident commissioners in Puerto Rico. Although they are Puerto Rico residents, since they get salaries and income from Congress, they have to file a federal tax return on that and then file the Puerto Rico tax return as well. So that's a really big misconception there. Another type of income, common income, are interest and dividends. These words are sourced, the interests are sourced to the residence of the payer. So this means that if you made a loan to a company in New York and that company pays you interest income, then that income is New York source. So it's federal source, and you're going to have to pay federal taxes. The same happens with dividends. So any person in Puerto Rico that has a Robinhood account and has a couple $100 in the markets, and they invested in one of these publicly traded companies, they get $1 of dividends. That's U.S. source income. They're supposed to be filing federal taxes and paying taxes on that income. It's not as simple as saying that Puerto Ricans don't pay federal taxes. It's just only on Puerto Rico sourced income. And that's a limited list of types of income that can qualify. Obviously, wages is the simplest and the biggest one because it's where you actually work. But for example, another common one is real estate income. Mm-hmm. Real estate income will be sourced to wherever the property is located. So a house in Florida will be sourced to Florida, and a house in Puerto Rico will be sourced to Puerto Rico. And that applies also to rental income. So depending on what you do, the mix of income that each individual has or that each company has, it will ultimately depend on what taxation they may have. As I mentioned, anyone that receives any dividend or interest through Robinhood, to any of those new apps or platforms that have come up in the last couple of years, they are supposed to be receiving a Form 1099 or the equivalent in the U.S., and they're supposed to be filing taxes if they reach the thresholds of income.
So one question that all this raises for me is the following. The common knowledge, which you just dispelled, is that, in Puerto Rico, people don't pay federal taxes. Now, you're telling me that that's not true, that they do pay federal taxes, depending on where the source of their income is. So that's one piece, and the type of income that they're generating. So that's another factor. The other thing that I think is important for us to understand is, what about federal payroll taxes? Right?
Exactly.
Do those apply to Puerto Rico as well?
Definitely. I was focusing first on income taxes. When people say federal taxes, they focus mainly on the 415 tax returns and the tax refunds and all that. But federal taxes encompass a real big net of different taxes that apply to mostly to us as well. For example, you just mentioned employment taxes, Social Security, and Medicare. Puerto Ricans pay the same rates as anyone in any state. There's no type of difference in what we pay in employment taxes. We pay the same rates, even if we are an employee, in which the employer pays half of the percentage and the employee pays the other half, or if you are a contractor, you're supposed to pay the 15.3% in total, just as if you were a contractor in the U.S. So in that particular concept, we are in equal footing, which in my personal case gives me a little of concern, particularly when we consider social SSI and other programs that Puerto Ricans paid out at the same level as the states, but we are not treated the same. Obviously.
So I think the most egregious one for me out of the payroll taxes is actually Medicare, where in Puerto Rico, we don't get certain benefits that are available to Medicare recipients stateside, yet we do pay the same amount that everyone else is receiving. I think with SSI, it's a little bit different because SSI is not funded directly through the Social Security Trust Fund. It's funded through federal appropriations. So there is a bit of a gap there. But when it comes to Medicare, we're definitely paying in the same amount as everyone else, but the benefits that apply to the island are unequal. So I think that this really kind of gets to one of the interesting questions I wanted to just explore a little bit. So who decides what federal taxes apply to Puerto Rico? Do people in Puerto Rico have any right to decide what federal taxes apply to them?
We have no say. We are totally contingent on what Congress does. And this is something as well that I find it funny when I see it discussed in the press and whatever mediums out there. Let's say we're talking right now about the incentives that Puerto Rico promotes at 60. There's a lot of conversations about them, Congress people requesting information, talking about repealing those acts. The only reason those acts exist is solely because of the federal treatment Congress applied to us on Section 933 of the Internal Revenue Code. Puerto Rico has really limited economic development tools, and we have to work within that framework that we have as a territory to be able to do anything.
But who sets the framework?
Exactly. The Congress sets the framework.
Exactly.
Whenever we see senators or Congress people talking about these laws, they can just go to the floor, propose an amendment to Section 933 and be done with it. Puerto Ricans can be integrated into the IRS system tomorrow if Congress wanted it. That's not on us. It's totally dependent on Congress and them, and they are the ones that haven't acted on it. We have, obviously, as you know, the resident commissioner that can have some say in it, but when all is said and done, we need the votes, and those are only for real Congress people and senators there.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think that is a perfect segue to the next topic I wanted to talk a little bit about, is kind of looking at it from the stateside perspective. So a lot of people believe that Puerto Rico only receives money from the federal government, but as we're talking about, Puerto Rico actually gives, quite a bit back. Can you give us an idea about how much Puerto Rico taxpayers contribute at the, national level annually?
So definitely, and these numbers right now are skewed downwards, mainly because we have been in a deep recession since 2006, 2008, roughly, and it's kept growing. But Puerto Rico contributes approximately $5 billion in federal taxes to the federal government.
Each year?
And that's each year. Yeah, and that's down from, in 20 years ago, it was almost double that, and it was really high compared to what we pay right now. But not only that, when people talk about federal taxes and federal payments or benefits that they get from the federal government, they like to talk that Puerto Rico gets like too much money, or they don't contribute enough. But in reality, even though we are one of the lowest paying states into the country or whatever, we contribute more per capita than 8 states currently. 20 years ago, we were right in the middle of the pack. We were contributing more per capita than 20-something states. So even now, deep in an economic recession, deep in after Maria, after the pandemic, we are still paying more per capita than 8 states to the federal coffers. So it's a really big lie that is told over and over, that Puerto Ricans do not contribute to the federal government. And consider this is with the current exception on Section 933. This is with mainly most W-2 wages not being subject to federal taxes, and we are still paying in $5 billion a year. Obviously, if that changed, the amount would change so dramatically that we would be right in the middle of the pack again in terms of contributing to the federal coffers.
And that, I think, gets to one of the fears that a lot of people have locally, which, the parties that oppose statehood for Puerto Rico are continuously, communicating over and over again, which is, oh boy, Puerto Rico is already in a tight economic situation. If, we do get statehood, then, taxes on the island would increase substantially, and your average family would, be completely unable to, live life and have a functional economy. What do you say to people who raise that criticism?
That simply is not true. So that criticism is one of the things that brought me towards developing myself in this topic area, in this area of expertise, and learning more about the interplay between Puerto Rican taxes and the U.S. taxes and all that. Because I saw these prominent figures from the opposition constantly publishing these op-eds saying that Puerto Ricans will pay this 60% tax rate if they were to become a state, that will be bankrupt, will be, in the worst situation possible. But that is all contingent or based upon Puerto Rico not changing anything on their side.
Yeah, which makes no sense.
Exactly. Puerto Rico currently has the top highest marginal tax rate in the country by a lot. Our top tax rate is 33% after you make $61,500 of income. That's a really low bracket to get the top tax rate. Meanwhile, the top tax rate from any other state, California, 13.3. We have almost 3 times as much tax rate, but picture this, the biggest difference really is you don't reach that 13.3% until you have $1 million of income in California. In Puerto Rico, you reach the 33% after you're making $61,000. So obviously the brackets are really way shorter. After you're making more than $50,000 of income in a year, you're gonna be subject to the highest brackets possible, and that's not considering the federal employment taxes that we just discussed,
Yep.
also it's going to be another 7.65% of each check. So this has to change in order for Puerto Rico to successfully become a state, because it's not a thing of Puerto Rico. No country, no state, no territory would be able to sustain an economy with 70% taxes. And
No. You might as well not work, right?
it's not logical. So obviously, all this opposition is based on Puerto Rico not doing anything to accommodate this transition. But as I just said, the highest tax bracket in any other state, it's 13% after having $1 million of income. Puerto Rico has been, what's the word I'm looking for, strangling the middle class for decades now. And that's why they have these really short brackets. And after making $30,000, you're paying a lot of taxes, when in the US, in any other state, you probably wouldn't be paying any taxes.
Yeah.
And what they have done is they kept reducing these brackets and increasing these tax rates to try to make up for the shortfalls. But they haven't changed, for example, property taxes in Puerto Rico. That has been unchanged since the 50s. And that's one of the main avenues that I see as a possibility to amend and change our current income tax structure in order to benefit the citizens of the island.
Well, let's shift the conversation a little bit and talk about another federal revenue raising measure that has been in the news a lot. They're not technically taxes; they're another form of revenue raising, which is tariffs. So in the past several weeks, past several months, there's been nonstop news about tariffs and President Trump's administration and their plan to basically reshape the global economy and attract manufacturing back to the United States by deploying this massive worldwide kind of redo of our tariff schedule. I think one of the things that's important to mention for our audience is that since Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, we're technically inside the U.S. customs zone. So will Puerto Rico have to pay tariffs on goods that it is sending through interstate commerce with the U.S.?
No, we won't be subject to that. We would be treated just as any other state on that aspect. Obviously, depending on how we are manufacturing, because this is one aspect that the tariff will have an impact on. Let's say cars. Obviously, we don't manufacture cars in Puerto Rico, but cars have a lot of components that come over from other places that will definitely have an impact on the prices paid to develop these items. Obviously, Puerto Rico, we have really little raw materials, so we develop a lot on importing. So although we won't be subject to tariffs when we are exporting our products to the U.S., we will definitely see an increase in our base prices to the customers itself.
Yeah. And then what if Puerto Rico were to choose the path of independence or independence with free association? Could a future administration impose tariffs on products and goods from Puerto Rico to move stateside?
Definitely. So that particular question is a really interesting one, because Puerto Rico is one of the few places that has a trade surplus with the U.S., mainly because we don't produce a lot, so we had to buy a lot from them. So we buy more than we sell them. So in theory, we wouldn't be subject to the blanket tariffs as they are being implemented right now. We'd be subject probably to the 10% base tariff that they implemented as well. But yeah, definitely, if we were an independent country or a
free associated state,
free associated state, we'll definitely be subject to tariffs. And as we saw here, this is not based on real numbers. This is based on random formulas that they came up to based on their economic models and assumptions. So we can definitely be subject to tariffs, and we don't know how much or how high they can be.
So last question on tariffs. So what if Puerto Rico were to become a state? Would Puerto Rico then have some kind of, added say in the whole process of federal trade policy?
Definitely. I mean, having representatives in Congress and senators will definitely give us a seat at the table. Right now, we are dependent on the goodwill of Congress people that, they have any type of relationship with Puerto Rico, or they simply, like us, or like our governors, or like a specific person, and they listen to us. But they don't have to respond to us. They have to respond to their constituents.
Yeah.
And right now, we don't have that in Congress. Obviously, becoming a state, having 2 senators and 4 or 5 Congress people will definitely allow us to have equal footing to negotiate this thing, to express our situation, to make people understand why it doesn't benefit Puerto Rico the same way other states do it right now.
Yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of people think that this is just a unilateral power that the federal executive is using right now. But the reality is it's actually a delegated power. The ultimate authority under the U.S. Constitution for imposing tariffs and setting international trade agreements is actually in the U.S. Congress. What the Congress has done under the existing laws, which were utilized by the Trump administration, actually use authority that's been delegated to it. So ultimately, Congress really does have the capacity to claw that back if it chooses to do so. But as long as Puerto Rico remains a territory and we don't actually have a seat at the table and votes in Congress, then we're basically stuck with whatever impact may come our way without actually having a say in the federal policies that impact our livelihood and well-being.
Exactly.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about federal tax policy coming out of Congress. Currently, there are proposals in Congress that are seeking to extend some of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act benefits that were done under the Trump administration back in 2017. And right now, as a part of that, there's some members of Congress, particularly a member of Congress out of New York, Nicole Malliotakis, who has proposed exempting Puerto Rico and other territories from certain provisions of the federal tax code in order to create incentives to advance manufacturing on the island. But the way that they're doing it basically says that the companies that operate in Puerto Rico have to continue operating as controlled foreign corporations. Can you explain to us a little bit about what that means, what role manufacturing companies play in the island economy, and what you believe Congress is trying to do here and how that makes sense?
So these efforts are commendable. I mean, what the congressperson wants to achieve is to bring back critical components and supply chain aspects back to the U.S., but it's happening in a way in which it perpetuates Puerto Rico's status as a territory, because a couple of companies will definitely want to lobby to keep it that way to ensure that they keep getting the benefits out of these tax incentives and whatnot, like it happened with Section 936 decades ago. While a lot of people talk about the economic impact of that section at that point, there were only a handful of companies that were actually benefiting from the incentives, and the actual job creation that took place in Puerto Rico lagged behind the ones in the US. And actually, when those incentives phased out in 2006, manufacturing decline in the island was pretty on par with manufacturing decline in the US. So there's a lot of misconceptions as to the aspect of how important manufacturing is itself and how it has changed in the last couple of decades based on the incentives. Most of the change in the manufacturing components have been due to technology advancements, not to tax benefits in Puerto Rico or laws in the US. As we have seen, so first of all, our wages in Puerto Rico are basically the same as in the US, at least minimum wage and how it works. When you compare that to other states, to other countries, to other places in the world where they can have really cheap labor, sorry, let me backtrack a couple seconds. The way that the world has evolved in the last couple of decades, it was geared towards globalization, and that's what we have seen. We have seen, we can communicate with anyone, any world, buy something from anyone and anywhere at any time, and we're backtracking on that right now with what we're trying to do with the tariffs. By bringing back these critical components on supply chain and doing it this way by perpetuating the Puerto Rico territory status, it won't help develop anything at all. It won't develop new jobs. It won't develop an actual new economy on the island. We can go back and see studies from the 90s and 80s that show that even with similar incentives in place at that time, the economy in the island was still contracting, and the shift in manufacturing started happening in the beginning of the 90s, not at the end of Section 936. So there's misconceptions as to how much benefit this type of efforts can do. For example, personally, I do think that we should bring over more critical manufacturing and components back
Of
to the
course.
US. But from the context of, let's say, Hurricane Maria, when Hurricane Maria happened, what happened to the saline supply for hospitals in the US? Most of that manufacturing comes out of Puerto Rico. So when we were out of commission because of the hurricane, that was impacted. And obviously, that's a critical component. It's needed at hospitals. So what I think should be done is the US should determine or design these 10, 12 components or items that they design or designate, as critical components, and spread their manufacturing across the whole country, not focus on the territories. Make this an effort. If you want really to focus on national security, you want to focus on redundancies, let's break these components into 6 different zones, such as, the FEMA zones that we have for disasters, and ensure that each chunk of states have a component of the manufacturing and make it such in a way that it has redundancies of let's say there's a disaster, let's say,
Earthquake or another hurricane or tornadoes. Yep.
Then let's say there's a tornado in Tornado Alley, and the Midwest or the center of the state, the mainland is destroyed. Then we can expand operations in the East Coast, on the West Coast, with those plants to supply what we need and not be hampered by those natural disasters. There's ways to work around this, ensuring national security, ensuring that we have critical components available, and ensuring that this intellectual property is protected as well from our countries without perpetuating the territorial status that Puerto Rico has. And it must be included it must include all 50 states and all territories in order to be effective, in order to protect the country itself.
So I think that what you're saying is really important. And let me just try to put a finer point, bring a data point in. So in preparation of this cast, I was doing some research on this, and the Congressional Research Service has a report on tax policy in the U.S. territories that mentions different issues for Congress. And one of the lines that really stuck out to me was regarding the type of incentive that Puerto Rico's current resident commissioner, Pablo Jose Hernandez, and Representative Maliatakis is talking about, which is an incentive for manufacturing to relocate to Puerto Rico exclusively as a territory and because of its territory status. And what the report says is, quote unquote, economic studies of one broader U.S. tax incentive, the now repealed Section 936 tax credit, indicate that any employment effects are usually secondary to the magnitude of effects on shareholder earnings. And average tax benefits for corporations often equaled, if not surpassed, average compensation per employee. What does that mean to you?
That people take advantage of Puerto Rico to make their pockets fatter instead of paying good jobs here. And I mean, I can see it, for example, in my own career. While I worked for the Big Four accounting firm, and I was highly compensated, and it was a good salary for Puerto Rico. People doing the same things that I did in the New York office, which I was part of, were getting paid $40,000-$50,000 more per year.
Wow.
And that gap kept growing every year because of pay raises that were higher and all that. So a lot of and my hourly rate to the client was the same as any other junior-based associate or senior associate. So they're getting way more income, but they're not really expanding. They're moving, for example, one thing that happened a lot with Section 936, and that may happen right now again with this proposed bill, is that they move over the intellectual property to increase how much revenue they generate by each employee here, but that's not passed on to the Puerto Rican economy.
Exactly.
In theory, during the 90s, it seemed to work, but it was solely because one of the requirements of Section 936 was that they kept some of the profits in local Puerto Rican banks. So that money was fictitiously in Puerto Rico to loan for all that.
It
But it
was
wasn't
capitalizing our local banking and finance.
exactly. It was capitalizing that, but it wasn't sustaining economic development. It wasn't part of the permanent economic development. And that's what may happen as well here. They exploit the intellectual property, patents, trademarks, but won't transfer that up to new more jobs, higher paid salaries. And I'm pretty sure I read that same study you said, because it was like they were making like $50,000 per employee more than they were making in the States. It was ridiculous the amount of increases that they were getting from establishing operations in Puerto Rico versus having them in the States, because we have highly educated people. We have some of the best engineers in the world, and Puerto Rico has a lot of highly capable human capital.
Yep. So one other thing that I wanted to mention real quick is, kind of going back to the approach that you were mentioning of having whatever manufacturing incentive, not just be for Puerto Rico, but also be for other states, is the MEDS Act. So this is legislation that was introduced in the last session of Congress by our current governor, who was then resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon. She did it on a bipartisan basis and also in collaboration with then Senator Marco Rubio. It's called the Medical Manufacturing Economic Development and Sustainability Act. And with that approach, there is a tax incentive that is provided for bringing back reshoring manufacturing to Puerto Rico, but it's also applied on an equal basis to all other stateside jurisdictions that actually meet certain qualification requirements in terms of being distress zones or zones where there's a need for economic development, right? And that's incredibly beneficial because it puts Puerto Rico in a position where if it does have a change in status, the tax benefit can actually stay, and it also adds an incentive for other states that have areas that fall under this distress zone qualifications to also be able to take benefit of this tax incentive, and that way we actually create that more robust economy and resilience that you're talking about, where Puerto Rico can be doing some manufacturing, but heck, if there's a really great place in New Jersey that can do it, or there's a great place in New Mexico or Florida or Louisiana or wherever it is that qualifies for that, then they can do it too. And that way we actually end up doing what I think having the federal common market that makes the United States such a powerful economy optimal, which is that states are actually able to optimize for their own competitive advantages, and then they support each other by that process of interstate commerce.
Exactly. We have seen the news that there's a lot of states with slumping economies. There's factories closing everywhere. We're moving away from fossil fuels in certain aspects. Technology is modernizing. Things change. So obviously, considering this unequal footing for all states will definitely benefit states like Kentucky, Mississippi, that are also distressed in certain areas, that need economic development, that need to replace our industries that are going out of business. And for example, there's cities on the states that rely solely on the chip jar economy. You have to be able to replace that in case that falters. There's a lot of places in which if you remove a military base, then that economy of that whole city goes under. We have to work with places like that to ensure that they are sustainable, that they don't depend on a single type of federal office or project there to be able to be...
Or that we become dependent on a foreign country producing things that are essential that we need for our national security and for our, healthcare situations, like what happened during the COVID era, where, a lot of the manufacturing was over in China, and all of a sudden the United States didn't have access to all the products it needed.
Exactly. We have to learn from that. We have to see what we needed, what's critical, what we need to keep in house, no matter what. We definitely have, we definitely can be protectionist, but in a way that doesn't isolate us from the rest of the world. We have to protect us in a way that we're secure, where, as the strongest, most powerful country in the world, we're gonna have a target on our back.
Yeah.
So we definitely have to be prepared for all this type of stuff. But it has to be with a measured and targeted approach. It can be all hell break
Indiscriminate, yeah.
loose and just
So switching gears a little bit here, and so Puerto Rico locally is also looking to do tax reform. And obviously the governor is working hand in hand with the local House and Senate. They've set up a task force to come up with proposals and ideas. To your knowledge, what exactly are they proposing to do? And how are they working to leverage the local tax environment on the island vis-a-vis everything that's happening federally in order to attract more investment and do more of what you mentioned, which is create businesses that are actually locally rooted on the island, as opposed to businesses that are just going to come to the island, do some manufacturing or do some operations temporarily, and then, if the conditions are not there, kind of leave. How can they leverage tax reform to actually create more locally rooted capital?
we have to overhaul our system. Sadly, I'd say that during the last 20 years, we have run away from doing the hard things that we have to do on the tax side of things in Puerto Rico. As we spoke earlier, we have to reform the property tax system. Right now, the middle class and the low earners are being strangled by these tax brackets. And when you couple that with a faltering jobs market or not being able to find lowering wages, it's definitely having a negative impact. Right now, there's been so much uncertainty that these working groups are, I think, the word for they're scrambling to be able to come up with new answers to new challenges that are arising every day, mainly because of the federal government decisions and all that. So it's still in the early stages. There's have been some proposals to equate some incentives to extend others that are currently in place. But right now, I see those as stopgap measures. They are just really short term. We have to work. It has to be a joint effort between the fiscal oversight board, the mayors. It's really important for the mayors, particularly when we consider the inventory tax. That's a really big tax and burden on the commerce side of things.
Yeah.
And it's a tax that it's not sustainable in much ways, but it's the way that cities operate in Puerto Rico. A lot of them will go under if we actually eliminate that tax immediately. So we have to work in tandem with the cities, with the federal government, with the state, local government, to be able to come up with a solution. Personally, I think that we should ease off on the income tax side of things, give a breathing room to the middle class, maybe expand those brackets, and try to uniform our system to the US based one as much as we can before a possible transition. First, we have to show them that we are able and capable of undertaking a migration or a combination to the IRS system. And I think that we can start that process on our own, simplifying our tax returns. Right now, the Puerto Rico tax return is so complicated. It's sometimes I feel as a CPA that a lot of these laws are made just to give us more business instead of trying to focus on the economic development or the impact of what these laws are making on the island itself. I think that the key component of everything will be the property tax and the inventory tax. We'll have to change that as much as possible while giving breathing room to the middle to be able to have real change in Puerto Rico and more sustainable growth. Obviously, this also applies to the corporate side of things. Puerto Rico corporate income tax is as well really high, and the brackets are really short as well. So it doesn't help foster an entrepreneurship environment in Puerto Rico. Obviously, the local incentives that we have brought over investment, capital, new businesses. For example, my own practice in that New York Metro practice in the Big Four accounting firm was here solely because of a tax incentive that Puerto Rico offered. So I had the opportunity to develop myself professionally in Puerto Rico solely because of that. So we have to make a balance on attracting this type of investment, but ensuring that it doesn't hamper our long-term growth because of 5 years of boom, because my term is 4 years and I'm going to look good during my term, and that's it. That's so sadly one of the things that we see, that a lot of politicians are short-sighted in terms of their decisions, because they're thinking about their next election instead of thinking what we want to accomplish as a country. We want to become a state, we want to become an independent country, but it's focused on what we want, the citizens, not what the governor or whatever the political class is.
Yeah. Well, that's super interesting. So one issue that has been extremely controversial has been this whole issue of tax incentives to individuals under the so-called Act 60. Can you very briefly explain what Act 60 is and whether or not that is a potential barrier to Puerto Rico resolving its territory status and becoming state?
So, as we mentioned earlier, each type of income has a different sourcing rule. Puerto Rico took those rules and said, you know what? Anything we do from Puerto Rico, we can incentivize, even if the client or the end consumer is outside of Puerto Rico. So Act 60 group all these different incentives, mainly Act 20, Act 22, that from 2012. And they took these sourcing rules and they said, hey, if we export services from Puerto Rico to the US, we can incentivize it because that's Puerto Rico source income. If we manufacture here and we export it, that's Puerto Rico source income. So they took all these different types of income that would be Puerto Rico source and we incentivize them. This means, and for example, other states do that. California can give you an exemption in your state taxes if they want. They can negotiate that with you because Puerto Rico is giving taxpayers an exemption on state level taxes. We are not working or doing anything with the federal taxes. We are taking advantage of Section 933, which, as mentioned earlier, says that if you live in Puerto Rico, you are exempt from federal taxes or in Puerto Rico source income. And we are developing a framework around that. Now, could it be an obstacle towards the process of statehood? Definitely. Not because of the economic incentives itself, but because of the individuals or companies that you may bring over. Only a couple of companies really take advantage of most of these incentives. So you will find maybe a small group of persons that will be personally affected if Puerto Rico were to become a state, that are the ones that are going to be putting in money or lobbying against any statehood efforts. But while people talk a lot about these incentives, there's less than 10,000 individual incentives approved. In terms of businesses, there's about the same. And obviously,
that's compared to like 3 million people on the island.
Exactly. Yeah. And even that between the last two census, U.S. white population in the island decreased compared to 2010. So definitely the narrative about these incentives displacing Puerto Ricans or hampering Puerto Ricans in any way is not true. But you definitely have a couple of individuals with enough money to be an obstacle if they want to.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really, really important is for me to kind of summarize a little bit about what's been said in this conversation, just to help our supporters kind of wrap things up. So one of the things I'm hearing from you is we definitely do need to simplify the tax code in Puerto Rico in very significant ways. We need to do so in ways that actually ensure that our state and municipal governments get the revenue that they need, but not in ways that actually damage the capacity for businesses to operate on the island. And we need to reduce some of the individual income taxes and even some of the business taxes by redoing the way that the tax brackets are operating on the island and make those simpler. We also want to increase manufacturing in Puerto Rico and leverage the manufacturing expertise and capacity that we have, but not in a way that forces Puerto Rico to have to stay as a territory in order to do that. So those are some of the things that I heard from this conversation. And then the question that I'd like before we go to our final wrap up is that I'd like to ask you is the following. So Puerto Rico's voted for statehood in the last 4 political status plebiscites. These votes were non-voting, non-binding on Congress. So for now, the territory status remains unchanged. But, if Puerto Rico were granted statehood, what would be your vision of how full federal taxes can be applied to Puerto Rico in a way that actually supports the island's economic growth and helps it develop to its full potential? What would that process entail?
That process will definitely entail a 5 to 10 years time period. We're so
So
far
a transition
a
process.
transition period. Yeah, it will definitely be a transition process in order for us to harmonize our local code and our systems. Because right now we're not integrated with the IRS. We tried to integrate during COVID for the incentive payments, stimulus payments, and all that. But right now, the IRS and Hacienda do not communicate fully. So there's definitely
So there's some technology and administrative issues that need to be worked through, and those are some of the kind of basic fundamental things. And then the other piece is the adoption of laws locally to take into account what is going to happen at the federal level.
Exactly, and I think that if we have the will, we can start with that process now. We can definitely simplify our system and make it in a way that if we are granted statehood or we achieve statehood, we can shorten this transition period. Instead of starting whenever we get that news, then we start developing a transition process. No, we have to start with that now, have that in place. So whenever we get granted statehood, we are able to hit the ground running, and not with the tariff right now that we're seeing everyone scrambling and pausing them because we don't know what the real impact will be. We have to be prepared for that. We have to work with the local framework and amend our laws in a way that we make it easier for that transition to occur.
That makes perfect sense to me. Just basically kind of begin making Puerto Rico's tax system more and more compatible, so you decrease the gap between where we are and where we're going to need to be once the opportunity to become a state happens. So our last question for you, Simón, thank you so much for everything. What recommendation and advice would you give to supporters of Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rico statehood movement to advance this issue and gain a greater visibility for it at the national level? Do you have any ideas or thoughts? This is a question we ask all our guests.
Community engagement. I think that's the key. I've encountered personally a lot of misconception and misinformation in Puerto Rico. I can speak freely. I was able, I tried to lobby Congress people personally for HR 8393 in past Congress. And I learned that a lot of Congress people don't know or don't have straight facts about Puerto Rico. Some of them don't even know that the Puerto Rican population in their state can define an election. In 2020, all the battleground states were won by margins less than the Puerto Rican population in each of those states.
Yeah, especially places like Pennsylvania, and it's huge.
Exactly. And as you know, Congress people, I think that they are really devoted to their districts. And when they understand that, it's not a remote island in the Caribbean, it's not someone that's a flight away from me. It's someone that it's living in my community. It's someone that has family here. For example, I have family in North Carolina. That's where I'm currently at. I spoke with a congressperson here from Raleigh. They didn't know that North Carolina has the 10th largest concentration of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. When you think about Puerto Ricans in the mainland, you don't think about North Carolina.
Yeah.
Well, we have I think it's number 10th right now, and it's enough in the Raleigh area to make or break her election.
Yeah.
So, and that's something that's information that they don't know. That's information that's critical for making them understand that Puerto Rico is not only that speck of land in the Caribbean. It's the 7 million of people currently in the mainland, and all our interactions, we are integrated. No matter what everyone says about Puerto Rico, we are definitely part of the U.S., just like any other state. We have our idiosyncrasies and everything. And it's making them understand that we are one and the same, and we have to work together to achieve what's best for all of us as a country. And I think that, that community engagement, knowledge, and voting, we have to vote. It's a right, but it's at the same time a privilege. We have to enforce and undertake that privilege and let people know, hey, if you don't take care of me, don't take care of Puerto Rico, I will not vote for you. I will let you know about that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time and greatly appreciate all of your insightful analysis on all these tax issues. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to learn more in this level of detail. And thank you for the work that you're doing to help educate and inform our audience and people at large about these important issues. With that being said, we want to ask all of our supporters to please hit like, hit subscribe, share this episode with your family and your friends. Let's get more of those voters and community members that are Puerto Rican and Puerto Rican allies stateside engaged, like Simón just said, because that's really how we're going to be able to advance this issue and make a difference in a way that not only helps Puerto Rico, but also makes America a more perfect union. Thank you so much, Simón.
Thank you so much.